Well, welcome back, folks. Today we're going to talk about a different project. Actually, it's one I wasn't really intending to even work on this summer. Probably going to work on it next winter or even maybe next spring. But here we are. This is a 1973 Kawasaki F11 250 Enduro. This is the first model year for the F11. It was quite a change for the 250 Enduros for Kawasaki. They went from a rotary valve design, which would have had the carburetor here on the side. They went to a standard piston port design with the carburetor mounted on the back of the cylinder. I never owned one of these back in the day. I remember them very well. I'd seen them around. The reason I bought this bike probably 14, 15 years ago was simply it appealed to me. And I remembered it from when I was a teenager. I bought it in northern Indiana, and I found it, I think, on Craigslist. Some of us might remember Craigslist. I don't know how often it's used much anymore. But I found it on Craigslist, and it was pretty much intact. It had large knobbies on the front and on rear tires. Someone had converted it to a bit of a dirt bike, put knobbies on it, removed the original turn signals, winkers, turn indicators, and that was about it. And other than that, it was pretty much all there. So I replaced the knobbies with OEM equivalent modern tires on the front and the rear, the trials type tires. Sourced a really good pair of the turn signal indicators, both front and rear, and had to do a little tuning up of the wiring, as I recall, cleaned the carburetor and got it running. And for all these years, it's really served just as a around-the-yard bike. It's a great survivor. It's always run very well for me. It's a fun bike to ride, and I just plunk around the yard during the warmer months a few times, and then it gets stored away in my heated shop over the winter. This bike actually hasn't run for 2 years. I didn't get around to running it last summer. It would have been the summer of 2020. So recently, a few weeks ago now, I got it out, put fuel in it, because again, I store my bikes dry, and fueled it up, checked the air in the tires, got ready to ride it, charged the battery, even though it doesn't need the battery to operate. It's got a magneto ignition system, but I charged the battery anyway, and went to start it, and literally when I put my weight on the kickstart lever, the engine was locked up. I mean, literally locked up. And I thought, that's odd, because it was, as I recall, summer of 2020 or fall of 2020 when I put it away, there was nothing wrong with it. And it's always been a good starting motorcycle, but it literally felt locked up. So I brought it in the shop, and the first thing I did was I pulled the spark plug out and turned the ignition key off, and went to kick it through, and oil came just shooting out of the spark plug hole. It was hydrolocked is what had happened, and that's what locked it up. And I know enough after all these years of working on bikes, don't force something that isn't right. And I knew it just wasn't, it didn't feel right. So you can bend connecting rods, you can do serious damage on an engine that's hydrolocked, especially if it's got electric start, or multiple cylinders and you don't realize it. Fortunately, this is a kickstart, and I realized it right away. Anyway, long story short, it was two-stroke oil. There's two types of oils it could have been, of course. Transmission, which in this is a Bel-Ray transmission, and I've talked about that multiple times, is red in color. The oil that came out was clear two-stroke oil, and that led me to believe that the two-stroke oil pump right here, very easy to get at, access, I just pulled that little cover off and the pump's right there. That led me to believe there's a problem with the oil pump. My first thinking was that the check valves, and there's two check valves, and we'll get into this in a little bit more detail in a few minutes, but there's two check valves there on the two lines that go from the pump to the engine that feed the oil to the main bearings and the cylinder. I was thinking one of those check valves had failed and allowed oil, two-stroke oil from the tank, which is behind this cover right here, to siphon into the lower end of the crankcase. That was my initial thinking. I do not believe that was what happened. I believe there's a failure in the seals, the seal and or O-ring behind this pump, and I'll tell you why again in a few minutes. The purpose of this video is I'm going to pull that oil pump off, and we're going to see if we can't replace what I think are the parts that failed that allowed oil to get into the lower end. See if we can't get this bike back in running condition. First thing we're going to do though is going to go over the computer, and I'm going to show you a parts diagram of the parts for the oil pump and the parts that I'm going to replace, and then we'll come back and we'll get in a little more detail about the work involved. As you can see, we're over at my shop computer. I have the parts diagram up of the oil pump assembly for the F11. I do have a Kawasaki service manual for this model. In fact, I buy a service manual for every project, certainly every project that I own, and most projects that I work on, even if I'm going to sell it on. Now these days I don't sell many projects, but I used to always buy a project or buy a service manual for a project I was working on, even if it was for someone else, and I baked that into the price that I charged the folks, and we'll let them have the manual if they wanted it. In most cases they didn't, they just said you can keep it, but nonetheless. Based on the service manual reference material I just shared with you, Kawasaki indicates that this pump really isn't serviceable, even though they do sell a few parts for it. Certainly the banjo bolt gaskets, those are really crush washers. You know, there's crush washers here, there's crush washers here. You can see numbers 11 and 12, and I think the number's 8. Those are not the concern right now. The check valves for this system to prevent backfeeding of the oil back to the oil pump are at the end of the oil feed lines right here and right here. The parts that I am interested in, and I think are the ones that I have to replace, and again this is a little speculation on my part right now because I haven't gotten into the engine yet, are parts 18 and 19, which is an O-ring and an oil seal. And in fact, I have those parts right here. I have the O-ring and the oil seal. Those are still available from Kawasaki, as you can see right here, this red box. And I actually ordered them a couple of weeks ago while I was preparing to work on another project. So I was ordering parts anyway, so I went and ordered these. And since I had the parts, that's why I'm working on this bike now rather than waiting till next winter. Just that way I make sure I don't lose the parts and just get the project done. Anyway, parts 18 and 19, this O-ring and this oil seal, are the parts that Kawasaki thinks, or suggests rather, that I think are the ones that are leaking, one or both. And what's happening is oil, two-stroke oil from the body of the oil pump is leaking past these parts right here, one or both, and getting into the lower end crankcase of the engine. This shaft right here, I hope you can see that, is the dry shaft for the oil pump, and you will not see a part number for that. That is not apparently available as a separate part, at least according to this diagram. So this shaft and this cap of some kind, I'll see what that looks like when I get in there, must be integral to the oil pump, and Kawasaki does not consider it replaceable or serviceable. There are a couple other gaskets like number 16 right here with a cover on the end, as I alluded to, the crush washers, those kind of parts, those wear items are available. But in terms of rebuilding the pump, these are the only parts that I can get easily, and so I'm going to remove the pump next and take a look at this and see what this looks like, and if I can in fact replace them, I'm going to do that. Let's reset up over at the bike. We're going to get up close and personal with the oil pump, and we'll go through a little bit more detail on what I'm thinking I need to do, and you can see what we're going to take a little bit closer look now at the setup of the oil pump on this F11. Obviously I haven't taken anything apart yet outside of removing the cover. Right here is the oil feed line that comes down from the oil tank, comes through the cover and attaches, I don't know if you can see it there, right there to that fitting. That's the inlet to the oil pump, and I have already removed that oil feed line. I did that a week or more ago already, a couple of weeks probably, to just prevent more oil from going into the crankcase. Of course I did pump all the oil out with a Kickstarter, and it probably took a dozen kicks to get all the oil out, and there's oil all over everywhere because it just literally the first time it came squirting out, and then I put a rag over the top here, a series of rags, paper towels actually, and tried to capture as much of the oil as I could because I didn't want it spraying all over, but literally I probably kicked it through 10, 12, 14 times before it stopped spewing oil. So that's why I removed the oil feed line right away, and there is still oil in the tank, by the way. It didn't empty the tank, but I didn't want any more feeding down into that crankcase. And I just plugged that with a silicone plug that I use for, well, I originally bought them for my powder coating system, but they work real handy for things like this. You can use a 6mm bolt or screw also to serve the same purpose, that is just to plug the end of the oil line. I could have drained the tank, but I didn't. I don't think I'll have to. This is an outfeed. These two right here actually are both outfeeds from the output of the pump that go to the engine itself. This lower one right here snakes up around behind and comes out right here. And that goes right into the main bearing of the lower end of the engine, and there's a check valve built into this end of the feed line right there. And then this line, the upper one right here, goes up around and feeds into the intake port of the fuel intake system just after the carburetor, and injects the oil into the intake port. Those are the two feeds to the engine itself. My initial thinking was that one or both of these check valves, probably one of them frankly, had failed and allowed oil to get into the engine. When I removed the cover, there was no oil here. It looked very similar to this. It was just dry as a bone. So there was no oil leaking into here. And I was thinking, well, one of these check valves failed. But as I was investigating and looking closer, I noticed that I could see air bubbles. In fact, you probably can still see it, maybe see it right here. There's air in this line right here, and there's air in this line right here. And that confused me because I didn't think that both of these check valves would have failed at the same time. That's just not likely. So that's what led me to start thinking there's something else is going on here. And what I believe has happened is that, again, either the O-ring behind the pump and or the seal, that shaft goes into the lower end of the engine and engages with a drive mechanism to drive the pump, has failed and has allowed the oil that is in the body of the pump itself to leak into the lower end. And in doing so, it pulled the oil back from these check valves, like this, and allowed air to get in from where they connected up here or down here. And that's why there was, or is, air bubbles. That's my theory anyway. Again, I don't think both of these check valves have failed. I've never heard of that before. I have had oil pumps leak before. I have never had an oil pump like this fail to pump. I've had a number of them that have had leaks for one reason or the other. But so I'm not terribly surprised. It's almost 50 years old, so that isn't very surprising. So our plan going forward, allow me to zoom in here a little bit for you. I'll disconnect the cable right here that comes from the throttle. That's what activates the pump to tie it into the speed of the engine. I will have to break this connection right here, break this connection right here. I will remove this grommet so I can remove this bolt, or at least loosen this bolt so I can rotate that spigot, the input, out of the way so that I can get at the screw. There's two screws that hold the pump body in place. There's one right here, and there's one behind this inlet spigot right here, or nipple. So I'll pull those two screws out after disconnecting everything, and then I should be able to pull this pump right out of the way. And by the way, you might have noticed my finger right there. I pinched that the other day working on a different project. Pinched it but good, as you can see. So there's a large blood blister right there. And eventually that's going to have to be lanced and drained, but I did that, but good. Occupational hazard working on old equipment like this. I'm always banging myself up. My wife's after me all the time to take better care of myself. Anyway, we're going to pull the pump off, take it up to the bench, and we'll do a bit of an examination to see what it looks like inside and what our options are in terms of replacing those two parts. Frankly, this might be a two-part video. I don't know yet. By the time we get into it, repair it and put it back together, we'll just have to see how it goes. Reposition the camera a little bit so I get it out of my way, and I'm going to go ahead and disconnect everything and get this pump ready to remove. I'm going to go ahead now and see if I can't get this pump assembly out of here. I expect it might weep a little oil once I start breaking some of the connections, so I'm prepared for that. Start by removing this grommet right here, and that grommet covers that bolt, that banjo bolt that is the pipe in feed, so get that out of the way, and that's to free me to get at that screw right there. Now we'll go ahead and free up the cable. That's free, and we'll break these connections right here. Again, these usually aren't very tight. You can't over tighten these because if you strip out the pump body in here, you have a problem. You have a pretty serious problem actually. And you can see I think you can see it right there. The banjo fitting's got a rubber insert in it. Just set those aside for now. So the oil lines are free. This is free. Now I've got to break these two screws loose. I've never had this pump off that I recall, and I don't think I ever had to have it off. And there's a copper, I think you can see that, copper washer behind it as a seal on both of them. And now I think this pump is free to remove. Of course, there's a gasket. Here comes some oil. There's a gasket. I'll see if I can't preserve that. I can already see that the seal right there. And I'm guessing the oil ring's in there somewhere. But let's get this over the bench. We'll take a little closer look. Over at the bench here, I have loosened this gasket. I just used a flat-bladed X-Acto hobby style knife like you can see there. Got underneath that and lifted it off. See there's a little oil on the back. And you can see the residual oil here, which I don't think should be there, so that reinforces my thinking that we've got a failure in here somewhere. Either this seal, which you can see right there, I think, and the O-ring I think is inside, and I'm not sure yet how to get at that. But if you look at the parts diagrams, and again just for reference, here's the diagram we looked at. This is a paper copy. O-ring number 18 and seal number 19 are the two parts that we're talking about here. This part right here, this looks like a cap. That is this piece right here that actually I can turn that with my fingers. Getting the seal out, I'm not too concerned about. I think I can get that out pretty easily. Getting this metal collar or cap off, I've got to give some thought to. I've never had one of these apart before. Certainly what you don't want to do is damage that or mar it up. You can see this is the drive pinion right here coming out of the shaft that goes into the pump. And there's, I'm sure, a worm gear of some kind in here that drives that shaft. This engages into the end of drive gear inside of the lower end of the engine. I got to give some thought to how I'm going to get that off because I don't want to damage that. collar right there, which I think I'm going to have to get off to get at the oil seal, or rather the O-ring. The oil seal I might be able to get out without taking this cap off, but I don't know if I can do the O-ring itself, which I half suspect is what's failed in here. So I got to give that some thought, and I'll bring you back in a little while. Well, that was easy, much easier than I thought it was going to be. You can see I got that collar or cap out. It fits in, over that. I could easily have showed that to you. I wasn't sure if I was going to get my head in the way of the camera or not, but what I did is I simply put this this assembly upside down like that in the soft jaws, the aluminum jaws of my bench vise, and just clamped down here on this edge with the soft jaws, and then grabbed the body and just twisted it right off, and it came apart quite easily, actually. So there's the O-ring right there in question. That's easily replaced, obviously. And then the seal, I think I can pretty easily pop that out too. So let me clean this up a little bit. We'll be back. Got everything all cleaned up, as you can see. The surface here, the gasket surface, I just used, again, my flat-bladed hobby knife, X-Acto knife, and carefully, very carefully cleaned that up. And then did the same thing with this piece. I then sprayed it down after that with the contact cleaner. I've talked about that many times. I didn't want to get brake cleaner down inside of here into the pump body, so I held this pump body something like that and just sprayed like this direction so that the fluid would fall away from gravity and not go into the pump body. And I think that cleaned up really nice, as well as this piece too. Then what I did is I took some tape, as you can see there. This happens to be Gorilla brand duct tape, very heavy duty material. And what I'm going to do is take a rounded end flat bladed screwdriver. This happens to be one of my favorites. And I'm going to go in here like this. I do have a seal puller, but it's too big, much too big for this little tiny seal. So I'm going to go in like this and hook that seal and see if I can't lever it out. And this tape is designed to protect that aluminum or alloy casting right there from being marred and damaged. I'm going to try to do it here under the camera lens so that you can see it, but if I can't get a good enough purchase like this to do it, I'll have to put it in my vise, and I probably won't record that. But let's see what we can do here and see if we can get this seal out here. There. And we got it out. And you can see the little indentation it put into the tape. And we didn't mar our surfaces, so we'll clean that up. There's the original seal right there. There's the new seal on my right hand. So we'll clean this up a little bit with some of that spray cleaner. And in fact, why don't I go ahead and pull this little O-ring off at the same time here. Let me get a pick for that, and I'll be right back. You can see I've got quite an assortment of, these are actually dental picks of various kinds. So these are stainless steel, very high quality. These are not the cheapos that you buy at tool sales that you see at the table spread out at flea markets and such. These are actually retired dental instruments. And you have to be a little careful when you use them because they are sharp. And you could damage the metal, so that's one of the things you don't want to do, but they are really handy to have. You can see all the different configurations, the shapes. In fact, I think I even have more than this, but you know what I'm going to do here is just get up underneath that, carefully, that seal, and just roll it off like that. And you see the original seal. That's actually fairly stiff. I'm surprised, given it's not exposed to anything but oil on one side. But so now we've got the seal and the O-ring out. And now we're going to go ahead and put the new ones in. Do a little quick wipe down of the groove where the new O-ring fits. And that's what that is right there, the new one. I was careful to segregate the parts. This is the brand new one. And that should just roll right over. Like that. And then we'll carefully clean the inside where the seal goes. Make sure that's clean and dry. Of course, if it's something like that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put just a little light oil around the edge here to ease its transition into the body of the piece. It's just a little light 3-in-1 oil, machine oil, and I'm thinking this might just push right in with my fingers. In fact, it does. Pushes right in. And I'm just going to seat it against the bottom of the housing, because that's how I believe the original was. There, I think we got that all pretty well buttoned up. Now I'm going to put a little light oil on the shaft here to ease the transition of that seal over that shaft as I push this back in place. This O-ring right here, I believe, is intended to seal on the inside of the body. A little more 3-in-1 oil than this part. There, snapped right in place. Make sure the seal didn't want to slide out. I don't think it did. And I think we have the two pieces replaced that I believe are causing the oil leak. I will clean up this gasket a little bit because I do not have a spare. It's intact. I'll just make sure it's clean. And then we'll go back to the bike and reassemble everything.